Lena's hands trembled as she stepped into the morgue, the cold air seeping through her jacket like icy fingers. Across the room, Dr. Marcus Hale stared blankly at a lifeless body, unaware that tonight, the dead were watching and waiting for something more than just silence. The morgue was colder than I had ever expected, far colder than just the chill of a refrigerated room. It wasn't just the biting cold that made my skin crawl. It was something deeper, something that seemed to sink into my bones and settled there, refusing to leave. The first time I walked in, the smell hit me right away. That sharp, chemical odor of formaldehyde mixed with something else, something metallic and faintly sour. It clung to everything, the stainless steel tables, the tiled floors, even the heavy curtains hanging at the entrance. I had taken this job as a postmortem technician to gain some experience, hoping it would help with my medical school application. But I quickly realized this place was unlike any other work environment. It wasn't just the cold or the smell, it was the silence. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty but full, as if it's holding its breath and waiting. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting long, harsh shadows across the room. The bodies lay motionless on their slabs, wrapped tightly in white sheets, faces pale and unnerving. At first I told myself it was normal to feel uneasy. After all, I was surrounded by death every night. But the more time I spent alone in that sterile, frozen room, the more I felt eyes on me, watching. I kept catching glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye, subtle shifts, just a twitch of a finger or the faintest rise and fall of a chest. Whenever I looked directly, there was nothing but stillness. One night, as I was checking a man, Espodia, middle-aged man who had died in a car accident, I leaned down out of habit to check for any residual signs of life, even though I knew it was pointless. The cold steel of the table pressed into my palms, and the smell of formaldehyde was overwhelming. I glanced at his fingers, and my breath caught. One of them twitched, a quick, slight movement like a nerve firing. My heart hammered in my chest. I pulled back fast, blinking hard, hoping it was just a trick of the light, or my imagination playing tricks after hours of being alone. But something about that twitch unsettled me deeply. It was like the dead weren't quite done with the living world yet. I tried to focus on my work, telling myself to ignore the creeping dread. I moved bodies from one table to another, wearing thick gloves, trying not to look at their faces. Their skin was so pale and cold it was almost translucent. The silence stretched around me, thick and suffocating. Later, as I prepared a body for autopsy, I noticed something odd under the metal slab. I crouched down to look, and there it was, an inscription carved crudely into the underside of the cold table. The words were fresh, deep scratches gouged into the metal. "Don't trust the quiet." The letters were uneven, as if carved by someone desperate or angry. My skin prickled with fear. I had no idea who could have done it. No one was supposed to be here besides me during the night shift. The morgue was locked tight, and all the other staff had left hours ago. My mind raced. Was this some kind of warning, a prank, or something worse? I tried to shake off the unease and carry on, but the message lingered in my thoughts. The silence seemed heavier now, as if the very walls were closing in. I found myself glancing constantly over my shoulder, expecting something to leap out of the shadows. Every little sound, the distant drip of water, the faint creak of the floor made my nerves snap tighter. As the night dragged on, I realized the cold was no longer just around me. It was inside me, chilling my thoughts and clouding my senses. The line between what was real and what was imagined began to blur. I kept telling myself it was just exhaustion, that the strange feelings were products of my overactive mind. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The bodies weren't as lifeless as they seemed. Something restless stirred beneath the surface of this morgue, waiting for me to notice. The message on the slab wasn't just a warning, it was a promise. And I had only just begun to understand the nightmare that awaited me here. The second night felt heavier the moment I stepped back into the morgue. The air was thicker somehow, as if the cold had deepened and settled like a fog around everything. I kept a small flashlight in my pocket, even though the overhead lights were always on. It was more for comfort than necessity, a thin shield against the creeping darkness I felt pressing at the edges of the room. The long rows of slabs stretched out before me, each one holding a body wrapped in white sheets, silent and still. As I moved through the room, arranging tools and preparing for the night's work, the shadows seemed to grow darker, stretching longer. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but I could swear the corners of the room were swallowing the light, as if the shadows were alive and hungry. Every noise, no matter how small, echoed in the vast emptiness. A distant drip of water, the scraping of metal on tile, a faint scratching sound that didn't belong. I focused on one body, a young woman who had died suddenly and unexpectedly. Her skin was cold but looked soft and smooth, like she was just sleeping rather than dead. I carefully pulled the sheet back to inspect her face. That's when I noticed her eyes were slightly open, just a crack revealing the faintest glimmer of glass. My heart jumped. I stared for what felt like minutes, unable to tear my gaze away. Then, as if she knew I was watching, her eyelids slowly slid closed again. I swallowed hard and stepped back. I told myself it was nothing, a reflex, maybe, or a leftover twitch from when her heart stopped, but my unease only grew. Suddenly, From somewhere deep in the room, I heard a soft tapping sound. It was faint and rhythmic, almost like someone knocking. I froze, listening. The noise came again, steady and slow. My eyes darted around, trying to pinpoint its source. It was coming from the cold storage room, a separate area where bodies were kept in refrigerated cabinets. I swallowed my fear and moved toward the door. My hand shook as I reached for the handle. The tapping stopped just as I touched the knob. For a moment, the room was deathly silent again. Then I pushed the door open and flicked on the light. Inside, rows of tall metal refrigerators hummed quietly, their doors sealed tight. The cold here was sharper, biting at my face. I scanned the floor and my eyes caught something small and bright. I bent down and picked it up, a human tooth, stained with fresh blood. A chill ran through me. Why was there a tooth here? Whose was it? The thought twisted in my stomach, making me feel sick. I dropped the tooth into my palm and glanced over my shoulder. The door was still open behind me, but the hallway beyond was empty and silent. I hurried back into the main room, heart pounding. The steady tapping had started again, but this time it was coming from right behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight toward the sound. The beam landed on a metal cabinet. Its door was slightly ajar. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and pushed it open. Inside, the cabinet was empty, save for a single dark stain on the shelf like a smear of blood. The tapping stopped again. I backed away slowly, feeling the weight of eyes watching me from the shadows. I wanted to believe this was just my imagination running wild. But the tooth, the tapping, the open cabinet, they felt like pieces of a puzzle I wasn't ready to understand. As the night stretched on, I kept hearing faint whispers just beyond comprehension, soft and urgent. Every time I turned, the voices stopped. I wasn't sure if they were real or echoes of my fear. When morning finally came, I was drained. My skin crawled with cold and dread. I looked back at the morgue as I left, the heavy doors closing behind me with a dull thud. I felt watched, as if the place wasn't ready to let me go. And deep down, I knew I'd be back, because whatever haunted that place wasn't done with me yet. By the third night, exhaustion had started to gnaw at me, but something about the morgue kept pulling me back. I was both terrified and strangely drawn to whatever secrets it held. I brought my phone along this time, hoping to record brief notes or sounds, anything that might explain the strange things I was experiencing. Maybe if I caught something on tape it would all make sense, or at least I could prove I wasn't losing my mind. I began my shift as usual, moving from one body to another, taking care to keep my movements steady and deliberate. That cold felt sharper tonight, biting through my gloves and settling deep inside me. The silence was oppressive, heavier than before. Every breath I took sounded loud in the empty room. I approached a body covered by a thin white sheet on one of the tables. The person was a man, middle-aged, who had died under unclear circumstances. As I pulled the sheet back to examine him, I noticed something I hadn't before. The body shifted slightly beneath the fabric. Just a subtle movement, barely noticeable, but it was enough to freeze me in place. I leaned in closer, heart pounding, and slowly peeled the sheet away. The man's face was pale and peaceful, almost as if he was simply asleep. I studied him carefully, trying to find a logical explanation for the movement. Maybe a muscle twitch or a reflex, I told myself. Then, suddenly, his eyes snapped open. His eyes looked glassy and lifeless, which made my stomach turn. But somehow, they also seemed aware. He stared right at me, cold and empty, yet somehow watching. For a moment, his lips moved into a small, cruel smile. I stepped back, almost dropping my phone. My hands shook as I pressed record, hoping to catch what was happening. But right then, my phone screen flickered and went black. I was left in the dark. I tried to turn the phone back on, my breath stuck in my throat. Then I felt something cold and heavy grab my wrist. I pulled away fast, heart racing, but saw nothing there. That's when I saw the mark on my wrist, a red frozen handprint, like I had been burned. Panic took over. I wanted to scream or run, but my legs wouldn't move. The room felt like it was closing in on me. The shadows around me grew darker and twisted. I forced myself to breathe slowly to calm down. I grabbed my tools and tried to keep working, but I felt like invisible eyes were watching me, waiting. The whispers started again, louder now. They were voices without words, scratching at my mind. I covered my ears, trying to block them out, but they just got louder, like they wanted me to listen. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Blurry shapes, figures stood just beyond the tables. They didn't move or talk, they just watched. I blinked, and they were gone. I wanted to believe it was my imagination because of stress and tiredness, but the handprint on my wrist was real. The cold inside me was real. And the feeling that the morgue was just a place for the dead, but a place where the dead were not peaceful, was real. That night, I left feeling more scared than ever. The line between the living and the dead was getting blurry, and I was stuck in the middle. Whatever haunted this place had marked me, and I knew it would not stop until it took me to. When the noise finally stopped, I was back inside the main morgue room, alone, or so I thought. I looked down and saw fresh footprints across the tiled floor, my footprints, but they led toward the refrigerated storage. and as I followed them, I saw the same tooth I'd found days ago lying in the middle of the floor. My skin crawled. Something in that room was awake, waiting, watching, and I knew with terrible certainty that the morgue had become a trapper place where the dead and the living were entwined in a nightmare with no escape. I don't remember how long I was unconscious. When I finally opened my eyes, I was lying on one of the cold steel slabs, the same ones I had worked beside all these nights. The overhead lights flickered weakly, casting a pale, sickly glow across the room. My body felt numb, heavy, as if I'd been weighed down by an invisible force. Slowly I tried to move my fingers, but they felt stiff, unresponsive. Panic surged as I realized my clothes were gone. Instead, I wore a thin hospital gown stained with faded dark patches I couldn't identify. I tried to sit up, but my limbs refused to obey. My chest felt tight, my breath shallow and cold. I glanced down and froze. My own hands were pale, waxy, almost translucent. They weren't mine anymore. They belonged to someone or something that no longer lived. The skin was brittle and cracked, like aged paper. My fingers twitched faintly, but I couldn't feel anything. I was trapped inside this lifeless shell. A mirror hung on the far wall, its surface shattered into jagged fragments. I forced my gaze toward it, heart pounding. The shards reflected dozens of faces, all of them mine, frozen in various stages of decay and horror. Some faces looked peaceful, others twisted in silent screams. All eyes were glassy, empty, and staring right back at me. It hit me then, horrifying and undeniable. I was no longer the technician, I'd become one of the bodies. The morgue wasn't just a workplace or a place to store the dead, it was a prison. Once you stepped inside, once the cold seeped into your soul, you never truly left. The whispers that had haunted me before weren't warnings. They were invitations. They had pulled me deeper into their world, trapping me between life and death. From the far corner I heard it again, the steady tapping. Slow, insistent, like someone knocking from inside a coffin. I reached out with my frozen fingers to touch the sound, but my hand passed right through the cold metal slab beneath me. No escape, no rescue. I looked around desperately, but the room was empty. Or maybe it wasn't. Somewhere in the dark, shadows shifted just beyond my vision, moving closer and closer. I wanted to scream, but my lips refused to part. I was silent still, and as the cold wrapped tighter, I realized the worst part. I wasn't alone. The bodies I had worked on, the ones I thought were lifeless, were waiting for me to join them fully, waiting to drag me under into a world where time stopped and hope died. The morgue had claimed me, and now I was one of them. The tapping continued, endless, unrelenting. No one will ever find me here. No one will hear my screams because I am already dead, but not gone, just waiting, trapped forever. In the silence,